Welcome to another edition of the News Review. In this edition, the United States has imposed sanctions on Iran targeting a network of companies and individuals that help export Iranian petrochemical products. The measures by the Treasury Department hit companies based in Hong Kong, Iran, and the UAE. They also target a Chinese citizen and Indian national. Washington says it is pursuing diplomacy to achieve a mutual return to compliance with the 2015 Iran deal. The accord ran into trouble in 2018 after the U.S. withdrew from it. Talks to revive the deal began in April 2021, with Iran now saying that they await a political decision by the U.S. Tehran has dismissed the latest sanctions as ineffective. It says Iran's petrochemical industry has long been under sanctions, but sales have continued through various channels and will be kept in future. To discuss that further, we're joined by Alicia Manier, journalist and political analyst, joining us live from Marseille, France, and also Marcus Papadopoulos, historian and political analyst and author, joining us live from London. Thank you very much to both of you gentlemen. Let's begin with Mr. Manier. It is interesting to see, after so many years, when the PMD was put aside and resolved through the 2015 deal with the P5+1 back then. Now the U.S. is trying to reopen the case by putting pressure on the IAEA.
The U.S. is always continuing with the same policy, Democrat or Republican. They both adopted a wrong policy, thinking that putting pressure on Iran by increasing the sanction or adopting a new sanction or introducing different kind of sanctions, this will force Iran to come to the table of negotiation according to the U.S. terms. This has been going on since 1979, and every single president imposed its own sanctions on Iran, achieving completely the opposite result. If the Americans will not understand that only by sitting around the table, being honest, because when they say to achieve a mutual return to compliance, they're just saying we want Iran to submit to our conditions, and we are not going to offer Iran any guarantee, and we're not removing the IGC from the list of terrorism. It means that they want to force Iran to accept what Iran is rejecting. This is the lack of understanding between both sides is resulting in more sanctions, which lead us to one conclusion. The West will only understand the Iranian escalation than make them feel afraid that Iran is getting closer to make the nuclear bomb. Otherwise, they will continue imposing sanctions.
Okay, Mr. Papadopoulos, Iran is not mincing its words. It quickly reacted by turning off a number of cameras it had voluntarily set up there as part of the JCPOA. How do you think the IAEA, will they actually get the message?
Well, the Americans are again interfering in the Middle East, and the Americans are again attempting to collapse the government of an independent sovereign country, namely Iran, through economic asphyxiation. And that is completely and utterly intolerable. The latest American actions do nothing to try and preserve the JCPOA. The JCPOA is far from being perfect, but it is a good agreement. It does attempt to lay a foundation for establishing a degree of peace, stability, and mutual understanding in the Middle East. But alas, America's latest actions are not at all conducive to the health, or what remains of the health, of the JCPOA. And in regard to the IAEA, in my opinion, they should really be focusing their attention primarily on Israel. Israel, unlike Iran, has nuclear weapons. Israel, unlike Iran, is not a signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Furthermore, We hear the American and British ruling elites on a routine basis projecting themselves to the rest of the world as angelic, as whiter than white. Well, quite frankly, their efforts, in particular Washington's efforts to wage economic war against Iran, is completely illegal under international law. Sanctions can only be placed on a member of the United Nations if the United Nations Security Council agrees to those sanctions. So quite simply, it is preposterous nonsense for the American and British ruling elites to highlight countries such as Iran and Russia as being violators of international law, when in reality, the biggest violators of international law are the American ruling elite and the British ruling elite. And quite frankly as well, if an independent media existed in both America and Britain, then the American and British populations would understand that their ruling elites, far from being whiter than white, are in actual fact darker than dark.
Thank you very much. Now, before we continue that discussion, considering some of the points that you just mentioned, let's take a look at social media reactions to this story. So we have here Ashwa, who says instead of returning to the JCPOA, that the U.S. broke itself. The U.S. is intensifying sanctions on Iran, especially during a tight supply in the oil market. Why is the Biden administration aggravating the crisis in his own country and other developing nations? Quincy Institute says it would be a failure of a U.S. leadership to sit back and leave the ball in Iran's court, particularly given that the U.S. ignited the crisis when former President Donald Trump withdrew from the JCPOA and reimposed sanctions on Iran, despite Iran's compliance. Irfan Chowdhury says, I must admit, I did think Biden would at least lift the sanctions on Iran at some point and rejoin the JCPOA, not for moral reasons, of course, but I thought the Democrats regarded the JCPOA as a U.S. strategic interest. But no, it turns out that he is practically the same as Trump on this. And Snyder says the JCPOA is a U.S. strategic interest, but Biden is just hesitating due to politics. And finally, Charles says Iran has no reason to trust the U.S. either. They never ended the sanctions after agreeing to the JCPOA. So for the credibility of the West, this is worthless. Let's continue with Mr. Manier. As Mr. Papadopoulos pointed out clearly, the Israelis are not part of the NPT. They're not cooperating with the IAEA. Still, they are able to put pressure on the IAEA to adopt a resolution against Iran. What does this signify, and where does the IAEA stand in all of this? Can it ever be considered a impartial international institution?
Well, I agree with your guest fully of what he said. And I would add that the IAEA, by its director, Rafael Grossi, visiting Israel, whose prime minister said he is a friend, and they both agree on a plan of action, it showed that the IAEA is not a professional organization, is not a technical organization as it claims, but it is a political organization that is fully under the control of the West. In this case, it is advocating what the Americans, the Israelis, and the British are saying and would like to see Iran doing to their advantage. This is why withdrawing 24 cameras or 27 cameras is not enough. I know Iran likes to take gradual measures in front of the IAEA. But if we all agree that this is an organization that works only for the Americans and only for the Western interests and is not trying to create a balance between professionalism and technicality, then I don't think that any camera should be still operating, because there are still another 40 cameras in the Iranian nuclear sites. So the position of Iran should be equivalent to the unprofessional position of the IAEA, that is fully politicized and is not behaving as it should be as an international organization. And as your guest said, these things should be monitored by an independent United Nations, but not in a United Nations that is manipulated by the US.
So, Mr. Papadopoulos, we just heard Mr. Manier, and also in those social media reactions, we heard a couple of people also pointing to the fact that the JCPOA was actually considered a U.S. strategic interest. This was supposed to be in line with U.S. policies. Now the Biden administration, who is also a Democrat, this deal, let's not forget, was signed during the Obama administration, which when Democrats were in charge. How did the U.S. policy change in all of this? Is it not considered a strategic move for the U.S. anymore to try and resolve this issue and go back to the JCPOA?
Well, I reject the premise that the American ruling elite overwhelmingly supported the long-term existence of the JCPOA. Rather, I am of the conviction that the American ruling elite regarded the JCPOA as a useful tool in the short term. But let us be very clear about something. No matter whether there is a Republican in the White House or a Democrat in the White House, the American ruling elite is extremely hostile towards Iran and has been ever since the Iranian Revolution of 1979. Further to that, the American ruling elite, irrespective of whether it is governed by a Democrat or a Republican, seeks the destruction of the Iranian Revolution so as to return Iran to how it was in the days of the Shah, namely a client state of Washington's. And even though Barack Obama signed the JCPOA agreement and offered his support to the JCPOA agreement, nonetheless, he also adopted afterwards some very aggressive steps towards Iran. So we have to be very clear about that. And I also wish to add another point, that international organizations such as the United Nations and the IAEA are outstanding concepts. I fully support their existence. The trouble is that over many years now, the Americans and the British and the Israelis have penetrated various mechanisms of the United Nations and the IAEA in order to subordinate them to their own agendas. So people should not be hostile per se to the United Nations or the IAEA. We should support their existence. We should applaud their very basis, what they stand for. But we have to relieve the United Nations, various mechanisms of the United Nations, together with the IAEA, of the hijackers. And the hijackers are, as I said, Washington, London, and Tel Aviv.
Thank you, Marcus Papadopoulos, historian, political analyst, and author out of London, and Elijah Manier, journalist and political analyst out of Marseille, France. Thanks to both of you, gentlemen, for sharing your thoughts and views with us. And thanks to all of our viewers for watching this edition of the News Review.